Moonlight Mask, known in Japanese as Gekko Kamen, the ally of justice. We don't know where he comes from, but we all know his name, the gallant Gekko Kamen. That's how the opening song introduces Japan's first action fantasy hero television show, Moonlight Mask. He's clad in all white, with a mask and sunglasses covering his face, and wears a turban adorned with a silver crescent moon. He carries 2 automatics and rides a white 1957 Honda Dream C70 motorcycle. He can ride while shooting with a gun in both hands, leap from ground to the roofs of multi-story buildings, and kick ass in hand-to-hand combat with 10 goons at once. Throughout the series, he will take on gangs of spies, assassins, ghosts, and a giant rampaging monster. But most importantly, he would set an example to the youthful audience of the 1950s. They may not know where he comes from, but to this day most of Japan knows his name, what he looks like, and recognize the many products which display his likeness, ranging from video collections, books, clothing, toys, arcade games, candy, and music, all the way to restaurants named after him. However, unlike his film-based contemporary starman, who is still reasonably popular with domestic and international fans today, Moonlight Mask's live-action TV efforts would not wander beyond Japan's borders. In the US, he is virtually unknown even to many fans of Japanese fantasy. Even though demo episodes of Moonlight Mask were dubbed by William Ross's Frontier Enterprises, there's no evidence yet of it being distributed abroad. Despite this, at-home Moonlight Mask was an influence on many Japanese properties which are popular around the world today. Along with being interesting because of its historical influence, the series should feel familiar to Western fans of horror movies, film noir, cliffhanger serials, pulp, and comic books. It seamlessly weaves all of these elements together into an entertaining action drama. It features mysterious arch-villains, masked gangsters, sci-fi gadgets, plenty of chases, loads of henchmen, and even the first giant monster featured in a Japanese television series. It's wrapped in a stark chiaroscuro, film noir-styled cinematography by Ryotaro Miyanishi, and accentuated with a moody yet energetic soundtrack by Ogawa Hiroki. Who is this ally of justice and where does he come from? Though being an inspiration for future creations, let's look back at what are speculatively some of Moonlight Mask's predecessors. It seems every idea is built from another. So for brevity and sanity, let's start in the 20th century, in the United States, with pulp author Johnston McCulley, the creator of Zorro. McCulley wrote the first Zorro story, The Curse of Capistrano, in 1919 for All Story Weekly. Don Diego de la Vega was to all appearances a dilettante nobleman living at his father's house. But when the need arose, he donned his black suit, a mask and a sword in order to become Zorro, a hero of the people who fought against an oppressive and corrupt government. Film critic and Japanese cinema historian Tadao Sato speculated that heroes such as Kurama Tengu and The Black Hood were inspired specifically by the silent film The Mark of Zorro, starring Douglas Fairbanks. Shortly after the film's release in Japan in 1921, a slew of imitators sprang up, with Kurama Tengu leading the way. In 1924, pulp author Osaragi Jiro started writing a serialized period drama about the Zorro-like anti-establishment hero called Kurama Tengu. While Tengu are a mythical, supernatural folk creature, this character is a human who uses that name to put fear into his enemies, all in order to fight the soldiers of a corrupt government in the 1860s. Osaragi wrote the stories until 1959. They were adapted into various films and TV series, starting with the eponymous Kurama Tengu. Osaragi's version of Zorro, who rode a trusty horse, dressed as a black-clad ninja, and carried a katana and pistol, inspired other very similar heroes such as the Amazing Black Hood, who also fought a corrupt government in the 1860s. The Black Hood was created by author Hitomi Takagaki in 1935, and later had a string of movies and 4 different TV series, keeping him in the public consciousness. At the end of World War II, prolific stuntman, actor, producer, and director Hayafusa Hideto self-produced, directed, and starred in a vanity project called The Amazing Falcon. This action film featured a Kurama Tengu-like masked Avenger who fought machine-gun-wielding bad guys and who now, in post-war Japan, rode a motorcycle instead of a horse and performed high-risk stunts on top of office buildings. Because it was self-produced outside of the studio system, no intact prints survive. Strangely, this movie used Offenbach's jaunty dance number, the Can-Can, as the background music during action sequences. Starting with Macaulay's pulp hero Zorro, then imported and emulated in period dramas like Kurama Tengu, then modernized into a motorcycle-riding vigilante, the next step in this evolution would be Moonlight Mask. Due to poor ratings, in 1957, Japanese broadcaster Radio Tokyo canceled its series, The Tale of Ponpoko. The show's time slot was sponsored by Takeda Pharmaceutical Company, which was going to drop its advertising when Ponpoko was canceled. In order to keep this valuable sponsor, Radio Tokyo producers and its advertising agency, Senkosha Advertising, scrambled to create something new and exciting for the time slot. Though this major sponsor, Takeda Pharmaceutical, was at stake, Radio Tokyo would only give it a limited budget. Senkosha Advertising's president, Toshio Kobayashi, had promised to deliver something extraordinary and was alarmed by the low budget. Feeling it was unreasonable to pull together a decent show for the budget Radio Tokyo had allotted, Kobayashi established Senkosha Productions as an in-house self-financed television production company, specifically to create this new program. After Moonlight Mask, Senkosha Productions would go on to produce several series, with notable standouts such as The Samurai, Prince of Space, Silver Mask, Iron King, and Super Robot, Red Baron. Once the World War II prohibition on U.S. programming had been lifted, George Reeves' Adventures of Superman became very popular on Japanese television. With this in mind, it was Senkosha president Toshio Kobayashi himself who came up with the idea of producing a superhero show. Our previously mentioned historical drama hero, Kurama Tengu, was pitched, but it was determined to be too expensive to do a period drama. Possibly taking a cue from the more contemporary setting of The Amazing Falcon, they took the root idea of Kurama Tengu and transplanted it to modern times in order to cut costs. This way, very few custom sets would need to be built, and almost no period costumes or makeup were needed. Radio Tokyo staff writer Yasunori Kawauchi was picked to write the new show. Kawauchi would go on to create several other superhero series in the same vein, such as Warrior of Love Rainbow Man, Diamond Eye, and Symbol of Justice Condor Man. There were several names suggested for the new series, such as Dancing Mask, Moonlight Champion, Sunlight Mask, and finally, Moonlight Mask. Kawauchi was a practicing Buddhist and wanted to keep the idea of Moonlight Mask as an upright, helpful person at the forefront. He was not like Dirty Harry or pulp detectives who left a trail of dead bad guys in their wake. He was an ally of justice. Helping those in need was the ultimate goal. In fact, the Moonlight part of his name derived from Candraprabha, the Moonlight Bodhisattva, who helps those in need. To make a fine point of it, Moonlight Mask's catchphrase is, "Do not hate, do not kill, let's forgive." Though he frequently used his two automatics, it was typically not to kill, but to incapacitate or disarm his opponents. Kawauchi felt it was important for this character to be someone who children in post-war Japan could look up to. Pointedly noticing the epidemic of violence and suicide of the period, he wanted this role model to be a strong hero, while also being compassionate and finding alternatives to killing. Along with writing the show, Kawauchi also wrote the lyrics for the very popular and jaunty theme song. It was so popular that Kawauchi went on to write lyrics for a string of mainstream hit songs throughout the 1960s to the 1980s. Along with the show's opening song, he wrote a theme for Moonlight Mask himself, a somber and spooky tune which is heard just before he appears to his enemies. Though usually just the first few lines are sung before he appears, once in a while, the whole 3.5-minute song is played. It's very effective at creating atmosphere and setting the mood. With Senkosha getting started on the series and keeping in mind the low budget and quick turnaround, a young Radio Tokyo assistant director and editor, Sadao Funadoko, was tapped to direct. This would be his first real directing job, and later would take on series such as The Samurai and Space Giants. Because of low budget, most of the production staff drafted for the series were inexperienced, but eager personnel from around the Radio Tokyo studio. Professional sound stages were too expensive for the production, so they shot in and around President Kobayashi's house, his reception room being used as private detective Juro Iwai's office, and the garage was used for bad guy, skull masks, hideout. Because of all the activity and fuss in the house while shooting the show, Kobayashi's wife would stay at a hotel during production. Out in the streets, the on-location shooting gives one an impression of Japan at the time. Still rebuilding from World War II, the cities have a lot of gravel and dirt roads. There's a lot of wild brush, weeds, and unmanaged trees. The outskirts of town are almost empty. Everything still feels pretty wild rather than crowded with urban sprawl and glass skyscrapers. On set, the production used cheap spring-wound 16mm cameras. These only held 28 seconds worth of film, which may have contributed to the fast-paced editing of the show. The production couldn't afford rigs and tracks for shooting dolly shots, so they used the manual zoom lens on the camera in order to get closer shots into a scene. This became a popular method of filming for many other productions throughout the 1960s to 1980s. One has to wonder if Senkosha's filming practices set a stylistic trend. Senkosha did it out of need, while other productions did it out of preference. Producer Nishimura Shinichi hired Toei Studios' stable actor Osei Koichi for the lead as Detective Juro Iwai, aka Moonlight Mask. Nishimura claimed the decision was based on Osei's clean-cut looks, which would be kid-friendly, and also for having a tense, engaging voice, suitable for a masked hero. This was Osei's first leading role on TV. Later, he would come to prominence as Shintaro Akikusa in The Samurai. Interestingly, The Samurai became wildly popular in Australia, producing its own line of toys and clothing. It was popular enough that Osei would visit Australia for samurai conventions. When he arrived in Sydney, more than 7,000 fans greeted him at the airport. This was more than had greeted the Beatles when they previously visited. Moonlight Mask ran on the Takeda Hour from February 1958 until July 1959 on Radio Tokyo, which is now known as the Tokyo Broadcasting System. Sponsored by the Takeda Pharmaceutical Company, the Takeda Hour premiered with Moonlight Mask, and Takeda continued sponsoring programs until 1974. It hosted a slew of legendary special effects adventures, including Subaraya Classics, Ultra Q, Ultraman, and Ultra 7. The first 71 episodes of Moonlight Mask were 10 minutes per episode, and after that expanded to 24 minutes, with a total of 130 episodes. The series was divided into 5 distinct story arcs, which we'll go over later. While Senkosha was producing the show for television, due to its massive popularity, movie studio Toei Film Distribution Company Limited was inspired to produce a series of widescreen theatrical movies. Each movie was loosely based on the story arcs from TV. While the settings and characters were the same, the actors were different, with Omura Fumitaki taking the role of Detective Juro and Moonlight Mask. The movies benefited from higher budgets, and it showed in the quality of their sets, costumes, and special effects. Along with the Toei movies, other media versions included a manga, which adapted the televised story arcs, an anime series produced in 1972, an ill-fated live-action color movie in 1981, and a comedy anime series in 1999. The character also inspired plenty of parodies, including Go Nagai's Gekko Kamen. Originally meant simply as a burlesque-style gag, Gekko Kamen became its own breakout property. Starting as a manga in 1974, it was later adapted to anime, and then a series of live-action movies. The Moonlight Mask manga was drawn by Kawata Jiro, who also adapted other popular movie and television properties such as Ultra 7 and Rodan. Early in his career, Kawata was known for The Phantom Detective and Moonlight Mask, which were his first major manga breakthroughs. What he's primarily known for today is 8-Man, which was adapted to anime and then dubbed for the English market as Tobor the Eighth Man. At the same time that Kuwata was drawing the ongoing manga adaptation, it was also being adapted for the rental manga market through publisher Suzuki Shupan. Drawn by Murayama Kazuo and Inoue Minami, rental mangas were aimed at a certain income level of customer who couldn't afford the slicker, magazine-style comics. These tended to be cheaper productions bundled into thick book collections and rented out like you would a movie at a video rental store. While the Kuwata series is in print to this day, the rental books were never reprinted, and collections sell at auction for huge sums. Batmania hit Japan in 1966, and with it came a manga from publisher Shonen Gahosha. Kuwata drew the entire Batman manga series based on the look and style of the Adam West TV show. With Kuwata's version, the villains had a much more Japanese aesthetic. Over the years, the Batman manga series had faded into obscurity, but was recently uncovered by American graphic designer Chip Kidd. He had a selection of story fragments reprinted in English in 2008. A few years after that, a cache of the entire run of the series was found. Immediately, DC worked on getting the series cleaned up and translated for the US comics audience. It is now available under the title of Batman, the Jiro Kuwata Batmanga. In 2011, one of Kuwata's original Batmanga stories, centering on the villain, Lord Deathman, was adapted for the American animated series Batman, the Brave and the Bold. In 1972, anime studio Knack Productions was formed from a mix of former employees from both Toei Animation Studio and Osamu Tezuka's Mushi Productions. Knack produced an anime series called The One Who Loves Justice, Moonlight Mask. Like the Toei movies, it also aimed at adapting some of the original live-action TV serials. In this case, due to the luxury of being animated, the villains and monsters were more exaggerated and fantastical. As an interesting aside, the first episode of the series, Batman of Terror, features a villain who looks rather a lot like Go Nagai's Devil Man. The anime series was exported to parts of Europe as Moon Mask Rider, and to Latin American countries as Capitan Centella, where it was very popular. Premier International Herald Enterprise Productions filmed the awkwardly titled Moonlight Mask, The Moon Mask Rider, which was a full-color theatrical movie taking place 20 years after the setting of the original series. This take on the character was no longer Detective Juro, but George Owara, played by Kuwabara Daisuke, a scientist from the United States. This was unfortunately a strange combination of garish, silly, and cheap. It was supposed to be the big budget and legitimate coming of age of the franchise, but was written off quickly and sank into oblivion. This was unfortunate since international distribution would have been a great avenue for reinvigorating the franchise. Most recently, Moonlight Mask appeared in the comedy anime series called, Little Moonlight Mask. It was a 25-episode, Sunday morning kids show filled with goofy humor. After Iwai Juro has retired, he passes his crime-fighting identity and sentient scooter to an elementary school student named Yamamoto Naoto. TBS marketed this series internationally as Little Moonlight Rider with an English dub. Let's take a look at the story arcs and compare the Senkosha television series to the Toei movies. The hero himself, Moonlight Mask, has no origin story. The series starts with Juro Iwai already using his vigilante alter ego. The primary characters of the series don't know how he has superhuman powers or why he fights evil. He simply is Moonlight Mask. Juro runs a detective agency which seems to help the police and government rather than dealing with run-of-the-mill domestic situations or street-level crimes. He has 2 assistants and 2 children who help him out. Kaboko is the smart female assistant who is the foil, always explaining things to Gorohachi, and thus to the audience, so we know what's going on. Gorohachi is the always scared comedy relief. He might remind one a bit of Jerry Lewis, Lou Costello, or Shaggy from Scooby-Doo, as he tends to stumble across the scariest of situations, which gives him a chance to mug his fright for the camera. From the police department, there's Inspector Matsuda, who continually needs Detective Juro's help, and by extension, gets an extra hand from Moonlight Mask. Inspector Matsuda is handy for bringing in an army of police troops when a big fight is on. The cases the agency runs into are pretty major, such as an international spy ring stealing an experimental bomb, a mind-controlled rampaging giant monster, and tracking down a 600-year-old treasure from an ancient lost kingdom. The Rogues Gallery is where we can see the influence from American cliffhanger serials and movies, and in turn, Moonlight Mask's influence on Japanese superheroes in the future. The first villain, Skull Mask, is the leader of an international spy syndicate. This syndicate kidnaps a benevolent scientist who created the H.O. Joe bomb, a hydrogen and oxygen bomb so destructive it was meant to deter all future forms of war. Skull Mask has much more dire plans for the use of this bomb. Of course, Moonlight Mask is the only one with the means to stop Skull Mask. In the Skull Mask story, we see the hierarchical setup for the rest of the series' story arcs. As seen in American cliffhanger serials, there's a mysterious ringleader who lords over a band of costumed henchmen with the intention of causing great harm, usually for profit or power. For example, in The Spider's Web, a crime syndicate is headed by the masked mystery man known as the Octopus. He uses his minions to destroy transportation routes and industrial complexes in order to gain control over corporate America. He always has several layers of cannon fodder between him and our hero, the Spider. During each episode, these minions wind up in a showdown with the Spider. Sometimes the Spider wins, sometimes he falls prey to a diabolical trap. We see this dynamic play out time and again in Moonlight Mask, either in a shootout or in hand-to-hand combat out in the middle of a field. In this first story, the henchmen wear trench coats, fedoras, and black bandanas over their faces. While the many versus one fight scenario is a pretty common trope going back into history, this particular type of setup, the hero fighting against multiple masked forces in a field or rock quarry, is very reminiscent of what is seen in many of the Maxed Rider and Super Sentai or Power Rangers franchises, among many others. It's possible the whole Masked Rider phenomenon may have been a direct consequence of Moonlight Mask. An article in the book titled Masked Rider No. 1 Character File relates this story. In 1970, Mainichi Broadcasting Corporation was looking for a new hero show to produce. Ishinomori Shotaro was brought in by producer Toru Hirayama for several meetings to brainstorm a hero specifically in the vein of Moonlight Mask, a motorcycle-riding ally of justice. Several concepts were iterated on, and Hirayama and Ishinomori came up with Crossfire as the first major concept. A white-clad racer, wearing a white helmet with a broad red cross on it. But Ishinomori felt the character was too bland and went for a more gothic design known as Skullman. A black-clad motorcycle-riding anti-hero with a skull for a head. Ishinomori drew a one-shot Skullman manga, but the producers felt this was too morbid for the audience they were aiming for. The final iteration would be the iconic grasshopper-themed Masked Rider, which started in 1971 and is still running in 2023. Ishinomori created several very popular franchises such as Cyborg 009 and Android Kikaider. The Toei movie adaptation of Skull Mask stays very faithful to the original 72-episode television storyline, keeping all the same characters and plot details. The serial is so long that Toei produced 2 movies in order to tell the entire tale. The main difference between TV and movie version is an upgrade in costuming and being able to see Moonlight Mask at a movie theater in an ultra-widescreen format called Toei Scope. In The Treasure of the Baradai Kingdom, the next villain is Satan's Claw. This villain is out to find a $20 million treasure from the ancient kingdom of Baradai in Southeast Asia. Lost in a catastrophe 600 years ago, in order to locate this treasure, he must first find 3 golden keys, which when combined, reveal the treasure. Descended from a line of thieves who were exiled by the royal family of Baradai, he is not looking to rule the world, but craves the treasure and revenge for his family's honor. Prince Shabanan, a descendant of the Baradai royalty, is Satan's Claw's first victim. He is killed and his golden key stolen. His Tokyo-based gang, like our previous bunch, wear black trench coats, fedoras, and bandanas. But as our expedition heads to Southeast Asia, the costumes change to more exotic sarongs and a mix of fezzes and turbans. The Toei theatrical version of the serial was simply called Satan's Claw, and it's really a treat. This is where it paid off to have a bigger budget. Once the story leaves the confines of the city, we are witness to wonderful sets reminiscent of the old Hollywood jungle sets, seen in the likes of Tarzan the Ape Man, and some feel like they could be from 1933's King Kong. There are no dinosaurs or giant apes in the land of Baradai. but there is a plethora of jungle adventure visuals. While Baradai Kingdom's exotic surroundings didn't include a giant ape, the next serial would. In Mammoth Kong, Moonlight Mask really takes the plunge into the world of Japanese special effects programs as we've come to know them today. The villain, called Assassin X, has a secret base which feels very much in the vein of a James Bond villain's, a large complex able to hold a giant gorilla-like kaiju. Assassin X wears vintage sci-fi garb, a white robe with a large black X on the chest and a black pointed domino mask. Like a good villain, he laughs maniacally when giving nefarious orders. His henchmen are clad in all black robes with a white X on their chests and hoods with two peaks on top, almost like bunny ears. Mammoth Kong is found roaming about in Alaska. He is captured and put aboard a ship which hauls him to Japan. During a typhoon, the ship wrecks and Kong sinks to the bottom of the sea. Though assumed dead, he winds up alive and captive of Assassin X, who brainwashes the beast to do his dirty work, killing political leaders and trampling several cities. Senkosha president Toshio Kobayashi related a story of how they came up with the scale of the sets. The effects crew went to a toy store and bought the largest, most realistic toy cars they could find. They built the miniature sets around the scale of those cars. Also, for scenes where Mammoth Kong and Moonlight Mask appeared together, a miniature version of Moonlight Mask and his motorcycle were built and put on a track in order to ride around the kaiju gorilla. This Kong is only slightly ape-like. The long-haired costume fits closely to the actor's body, giving him a very human form, reminiscent of various takes on Bigfoot. His head is like a simian's, but with two huge tusks protruding from his mouth and a large horn in the middle of his forehead. In this case, the Toei movie version of the serial, called Monster Kong, felt much less grand. The new Monster Kong is a completely different beast with a slightly different story. While it is still heavily in the land of science fiction, with atomic superweapons and other gadgets, this Monster Kong is more of a Jekyll and Hyde story. It involves the International Assassin Team and their kaiju henchmen who can change from man to beast. He's human-sized, wears normal human clothes, and drives cars and helicopters and uses a machine gun. Similar to the television version, this gang is a group of assassins who want to kill off government officials and intellectuals in order to spread fear and control the population. In The Ghost Party Strikes Back, we have a new type of gang. This group has their own super science gimmick, as they can turn invisible. But their aim is fairly similar to the Skull Mask gang. The Ghost Party are also spies, but instead of kidnapping a scientist to get a bomb, they kill important officials, then masquerade as them in order to infiltrate government and scientific facilities. This is in order to gain access to radioactive materials to cause more mayhem and destruction. Our henchmen this time are in black robes with tall pointy hoods, with a large single eyeball sewn in front of the face. The final chapter in the Moonlight Mask live-action series is Don't Toy with Revenge. Someone has taken up the identity of the deceased Skull Mask seen in the first story arc. By weaving a complex web of mystery and murder, his fiendish game is to take revenge on a group of shipwrecked survivors who abandoned him on an isolated island full of deadly spiders. A portion of this serial takes place in flashbacks to a World War II-era Pacific island where the group of survivors fight for their lives, dealing with savage living conditions and low rations. This may remind classic movie buffs a bit of what's known as the old dark house mystery movies of the 1930s and 40s. A whodunit with a small pool of suspects, but in Moonlight Mask's case, with the inclusion of masked opponents and plenty of shootouts. Story-wise, the Toei movie versions of the last two serials do not differ that much from the TV show. Again, a higher budget for location and effects were a boost to the overall quality. A +1 for these last two is that the television serials were generally felt to drag a bit, so the movies condensed the stories down to a terse 65 minutes apiece. There were some striking differences throughout the Toei movie series, such as musical interludes. At some point in each movie, a scene occurs where there is a bar room or cabaret with a band which sings a whole song, and this slows down the momentum of the action. There is also a pronounced addition of goofball, almost cartoon-like comedy, including pratfalls and slide whistle sound effects. By the final episodes of Don't Toy with Revenge, Moonlight Mask was starting to take some heat from newspapers and magazines about its action and violence. Children were emulating their hero, sometimes engaging in acrobatics, which were getting them injured. And even worse, one child was killed. In particular, an ultra-conservative paper, Shukan Shincho, slammed the series and writer Kawauchi to the point that he sued the paper for defamation of character. But by then, it was too late. With rumors of censorship and the ongoing issue of violence, the first special effects superhero show in Japan had been canceled. With the reboots and merchandise, the public has not forgotten about their first TV hero and its creator. In Hokodate, Hokkaido, there is a statue of the 1972 cartoon version of Moonlight Mask. Dedicated to Kawauchi, the plaque reads, "Do not hate, do not kill. Let's forgive." In 2001 in Misawa, Aomori, a monument was also erected for Moonlight Mask and Kawauchi in commemoration of him living there for 20 years, with much the same sentiment, wishing for peace and justice for the world.